Hello, Andrew. It's really good to see you again. How are you today?
I'm great and looking forward to this conversation on our favorite subject.
Yes, well, I want to talk, want us to talk today about the joy and power of shadow healing. And first, I think it's important for us to define for everyone what we mean by the shadow. Carl Jung said that it's an unconscious part of the psyche that is very opposite of our image of ourselves, very
Yeah.
opposite of what our ego thinks of us. And we go to great lengths to hide it. Much of it is unconscious, and we don't even know that we're behaving in a shadow manner.
We
Uh,
can't even tell we have a shadow attack upon us. Yes.
Exactly. And so, as a result of that unconsciousness, the shadow can come out and do things that are very opposite of what we think of ourselves. And you talk about, and he talked about, I talk about the individual shadow and the collective shadow. We'll
Yeah.
get into that more deeply today.
And
Uh,
they're so intertwined on so many levels, but they need to be differentiated because people need to become aware of how powerful the collective shadow is on our individual formations and lives, and especially now because this vast, huge evolutionary crisis that we're living through is casting a series of overwhelmingly intense shadows, which is affecting everybody's psyche and everybody's behavior.
Yes, and we're going to go deeply into that. I want to just mention, a couple of years ago, you said to me, Carolyn, you really should write a book on the shadow.
Yes.
And so I always take your word and your advice seriously. So
Thank
I
you.
went to the computer and started. And last fall, I completed and released Dark Gold, The
Uh,
Human Shadow and the Global Crisis. And so we'll talk a little bit about the book today. But I'm so grateful to you for inspiring me and then endorsing me in doing that.
well, I think it's a magnificent book, and I think it's an indispensable book now because this is the era of the shadow. The shadow contains all the treasures that we need to go forward, but we have to find the courage to look at our own shadow, the way it colludes with the shadows that are now destroying the planet, and to wake up to the power of the shadow in human nature so that we can evolve a more humble and sober and embodied and radical spirituality. This is the task of humanity at the moment.
Absolutely. And right now, Andrew, we're witnessing an explosion of the shadow in this country with the constellation of it by political candidates such as Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. Trump, in particular, is giving the masses complete permission to wallow in racism and violence. And Ted Cruz intends to institute a theocracy of Christian fundamentalism based delusionally on the premise that God told him to run for president. And, the fact that both these candidates are so wildly popular with so many people is testimony to the stranglehold that the shadow has in our country. I'd
Yeah.
like you to talk about this, please.
America's whole evolution has been built on a series of terrible crimes. There was the genocide of the Native Americans. There was the long drawn out genocide of slavery. There was the genocide of the animals, the terrifying slaughter of the bison, for example, and the buffalo. Then America became addicted to economic power, and there was the moral genocide, the genocide of the dream of America. And then America became a world empire, thinking that in its dementia it was spreading the values of democracy, when in fact it invaded country after country, caused untold suffering and untold madness. If I was describing a human being to you, you would know that I was describing a psychotic personality. What we're now seeing is the boiling, psychotic shadows of this long orgy of denial and addiction to power that has been American history. And it's boiling up at the moment where it would boil up, which is that the whole dream of America is now revealing itself as completely bankrupt. There's no such thing as infinite growth. There's no such thing as a fair and just economy when it's entirely run by the billionaire class. There's no such thing as democracy because this is the best democracy that money can buy. And there is no such thing as American identity because it's absolutely split by racism. The dream is dying, and at the moment that the dream dies, those who wish to defend the dream come together in a psychosis of denial and rage and racism and madness, and this is what's being expressed through Trump and Cruz and through the fundamentalists of all kinds. And this is a very frightening moment in the history of the planet, because if any of these people get into power, the future of the planet is at stake, because, as you very well know, Trump and the rest are climate deniers. They deny climate change. So at the very moment when we need to make radical moves towards having any kind of future, we could have in power examples of the worst part of our madness, making that madness now finally lethal and driving us all to extinction. This is the kinds of times we find ourselves in, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is. And I'd like you to talk about the collective and personal shadows in your work. You talk about the 5 collective shadows and the 8 personal shadows. So yeah, I'd really like you to elaborate on these. And if I have comments, I'll jump in.
What I come to understand is that everyone knows at some profound level that we're going through an evolutionary crisis of unprecedented extent. You wouldn't guess that everybody knew from the coma of denial that's out there. But what I mean by everybody knowing is that all of our interconnected psyches are registering the continuing seismic shocks of an unparalleled global interconnected disaster, a complete collapse of systems. That is going on. We all know in the depths of our psyche that the environment is dying, that death is reverberating through our psyches. We all know in the depths of our psyches that there will be no habitable sea, there will be no fish in the sea by the end of the 40s. We all know that billions of people are living in slavery in horrific conditions while a very few get richer. All of this is being registered. And what's being registered at an even greater level than the horror of all of this is the madness of all of this, the madness that the human race is in the grip of, a madness of greed that drives it to suicidal and matricidal destruction of its own environment. Now, once you become conscious yourself through a lot of grueling work of how extensive this terrible crisis is and how challenging on every level, then you become aware slowly of how you're being unconscious of how you were already being affected by the crisis has blinded you to the hugely powerful radiation, the black radiation, that this potential extinction crisis is actually casting on the human psyche. This happened to me when I was writing The Hope, and I went into a very profound depression, but it was much more than a depression. It was a surrender to feeling what I had been repressing, this overwhelming, boiling anguish, despair, horror at what is actually taking place. And as I watched the feelings over a period of about 3 months, I came to identify in myself 3 major shadows followed by 2 major shadows. It was in a 2-part process. I came to identify that the first shadow that was being radiated by this crisis was disbelief, sheer, amazed, bewildered, shattered disbelief that anything so overwhelming could be taking place. Just to imagine that we could be in the situation that we actually are is already to stretch the imagination beyond all probability and all seeming rationality and all imaginable illusion about human nature. So to begin to really understand that we are potentially in a terminal crisis is a huge act, and that's why the disbelief is such a strong shadow. Once you uncover your disbelief, you really meet what it's hiding, and that is denial. Deep, deep desire to deny, to actually deny that such a thing could be happening, because to accept it is such unimaginable suffering and the threat of being paralyzed by grief and by impotence. And once you really uncover that shadow of denial, and realize how much of your thinking is a shadow dance with denial simply because you're not strong enough to bear what's actually going on, then you get to the third shadow, which is the third shadow of dread, of the dread that you will feel when you really begin to accept that unless we go through a major transformation on every level, a major transformation put into action, urgent action, the world's future is incredibly dark and terrifying. And then, after these three shadows, I really found myself being driven by the experience to go deeper, and a fourth shadow appeared, and that was the shadow of radical disillusion with human nature. After the dread, then what you're being protected from by the dread, because the disillusion that you face in yourself at the range of human depravity, the range of human destructiveness, the range of what human beings capable through being inflamed by greed are capable of doing, that terrible recognition that comes from staring into the face of what's really going on drives you to a level of outrage and horror and disillusion at human nature, which is almost unbearable, which is a source of very radical despair, and is the reason why so many people are in a depression without knowing it, because that radiation of disillusion is touching them. And then what I discovered is that after uncovering that in myself and really facing it, facing the level of absolute horror of what human beings have become, that is in my psyche, and I believe in the psyche of everybody who's alert to the depth of this crisis, which is at some depth everybody, then you uncover a fifth tremendous shadow. And this shadow is the shadow of the death wish. I thought that I wasn't touched by this shadow. I thought that I really had been instructed deeply enough mystically and had come through enough in my life not to be threatened at this level. But I was in a dream about myself, and what I uncovered through a series of very painful experiences was that at the core of my psyche is, as in the case of nearly every other sacred activist, a death wish, a wish not to be here at this moment when there is so much horror, terror, confusion, suffering exploding everywhere, and where these solutions seem so hard to grasp and almost impossible to implement. It's a very excruciating time. So when you really begin to uncover your addiction to these shadows, because I think we all have those addictions, and the way in which these shadows permeate our psyche, you come to understand that they're being worked on by an invisible black radioactive field of great confusion and suffering that is the radioactive field of this massive crisis. And you also come to understand how essential it is to become as clear as you possibly can about these shadows, because then you have the chance of offering them up to grace, offering them up to the divine light, offering them up to the heart's compassion, so that their treasures of insight can be yielded to you so that you can come to see how people all around you are acting through the invisible powers of these dark shadows, thinking that they're reacting, but actually being the tools of these shadows. And you can see how you've acted yourself and how you continue to dance through all the dark halls of these five shadows as you experience at a cellular level what's happening to the world. This is the only way, I think, that we can possibly begin to comprehend the kind of lunacy that we're seeing in the world on every level, on every stage. You have to see it as a kind of breakdown in the lunatic asylums, through the crumbling of the walls, through the burning of the beds. That's what's going on. It is very extreme. Then you have to do the work of the personal shadows, you know, and how they collude with these five shadows. And that is another revelatory journey in itself, with great treasures to be found in it.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. And one of the things
How
that
do you relate to what I said, Carolyn, about the collective shadows? How do they strike you?
well, absolutely right on. I mean, you could not have been more accurate. And I appreciate your sharing your personal process of how you went through that.
Oh,
There was
it's
some,
a terrible process for everybody. I mean, we could sit here and we could talk about the shadow, but we've both been through multiple hells to learn what we are graced to learn about the shadow. This is very ferocious work. That's why people are really scared of it. You understand why, because once you've been dragged through it by something better than yourself that has held you to it and given you its wisdom, you understand why people want to avoid it so much, because it leaves no flattering vision of yourself alive. It destroys your illusions. That's its huge gift, that it actually releases you from fantasy and illusion and magical thinking and self-love and narcissism. It begins to free you to see the world as it truly is, and therefore to claim yourself at a much deeper level of encounter with the real world. And that's a gift that only shadow work can give you, but you have to have the guts to approach shadow work, and also the information about shadow work, and also the tools. Otherwise, coming into this very fierce territory will explode you.
we will talk about that in a little bit later in our conversation, because I want to talk about, you know, what is the purpose of doing the shadow work. But for the moment, I want to ask you another question, which has to do with the shadow of both fundamentalist Christianity and New Age spirituality. I'd like you to talk about how these approaches to the sacred are not only delusional, but how they actually feed the personal and collective shadow.
Well, I'm delighted that you brought fundamentalism of the Christians and the New Age together. I think that is very naughty of you and very properly wicked, because yes, they are both fundamentalist. The Christians obviously are dangerous beyond belief, because not only do they believe that only the Christians are going to go to heaven, they also believe in this mad apocalyptic scenario by which Jesus is returning imminently through a massive, extremely awful war, which the Christian fundamentalists are doing nothing to prevent, naturally, because Jesus is going to appear in the middle of them. So the lunacy of that is scary on every level. And the violence against the soul and against the truth of God's presence in and as everything, and God's truth in all of the different revelations, is extreme. It is a psychotic position. That's fundamentalism from the Christian perspective. But when you turn and look at modern corporate New Cage theory, I like New Cage better than New Age. My Jeff Brown, who's a great friend of mine, wonderful lion of a man, he calls it the New Cage. When you look at what they claim to believe, you realize that it is fundamentalism in another dress. They claim to believe that only the light is ultimately real. They claim to believe that looking at any kind of disaster or difficulty or agony or injustice is actually helping that disaster or injustice to grow, which is completely insane. And they claim to believe that God is a kind of ATM waiting to fulfill all of our fantasies and desires, a hired slave who will help us manifest whatever our ego lunacy wants to manifest at any given moment, from a Cuban houseboy to a Malibu mansion. This is an obscene, narcissistic, totally self-absorbed vision of spirituality, which has led to monstrous spiritual, sexual, economic abuse, and that fits perfectly the corporate model of atomized individualism that is anyway floating this spirituality, because as long as people believe this rubbish, they will never be heartbroken by the truth of where we are. They'll never see the systems of cold evil in their true structures, and they'll never rise in a great wave of love in action to do anything about it. And so this kind of fundamentalism becomes perfect to keep the corporate structure going, just as Christian fundamentalism becomes the perfect underpinning of the military-industrial complex. It's a wonderful cocktail, invented in America.
Yes, of course. And thank you for that. A moment ago, we just talked about why we should do shadow work, what's in it for us. You know, Jung said that 80% of the shadow is probably pure gold. So
Yeah.
I wonder, you know, you talked about the hard work of,
Yeah.
of doing shadow work and how grueling it can be.
Right.
So what's in it for us? Why should we do it?
Well, the first thing that's in it for us is clarity, is lack of illusion, is the shadow work through humiliating our false selves brings us over time to the threshold of true awe at the unknowable majesty of the divine, finally divested of self-importance, finally through great grueling work brought to the moment where you feel humble enough to truly accept how little you know and how little you are before the majesty. That is the supreme reward of shadow work, which is that it kills you. It kills your fantasy about yourself, your fantasy about the world, your fantasy about your nation, your fantasy about your culture, your fantasy about the human race, and your fantasy about God as being pure light and pure love, serving your ego. All of those fantasies are obliterated by shadow work, are annihilated by it. And that is its finest, highest, noblest gift to you, because in the end, you don't need any of those fantasies. They keep alive a false vision, a false self. All you need is what shadow work will boil away to reveal in you is your own spacious, deathless consciousness, your own I am presence. Everything else is unreal, and shadow work will reveal that. That's on the highest sense. And then the second thing that shadow work will give you is heartbroken compassion for every other lunatic in the asylum. Because shadow work will reveal to you, if you're doing it, that you are, for whatever gifts you have, hopelessly crazy and limited in very unique ways to you, just as everybody else you meet are also inmates of the lunatic asylum and crazy in their own ways because of the same reasons, because of the traumas you've endured, the betrayals you've suffered, the mad beliefs you've cherished and been fed, the obscene body-spirit split that you've endured, the sexual harassment that you've suffered, all the different kinds of rubbish and crazy nonsense that go to make the human experience and painful. And that is the beginning of real compassion, because you realize through grace, you are one inmate in a global lunatic asylum, and that your one hope of staying true to truth is to treat everybody else in the asylum with as much heartbroken compassion as you possibly can, and with as much skillful understanding as you possibly can. That is the beginning of enlightenment. I think the third thing, and let me just finish, is that what the shadow really does give you, I think, and I hope that this is something that we can show and should show in our lives, is a much richer sense of humor about yourself, about other people, about what's really going on. it makes you savvy in the funniest and holiest sense, because once you've unmasked your own shadow in deep ways, you are kept constantly amused by your own fantasies popping up, but also by the ways in which other people claiming to be living conscious lives are actually dancing as puppets of their own unconscious drives. It's funny. And it gives you radical humor about the human condition, which, my God, you need in this situation. So it's not a cynical humor. It's a robust, fierce humor. And I think it's very important for sacred activism and for people on the evolutionary path, that kind of humor, and only shadow work can give you that.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, we're going to talk about humor in a moment when we talk about our joy book that we're working on. But, you know, one of the things I've discovered in doing shadow work is that as I do that work and my ego begins to diminish, and God knows I have much, much more shadow work to do for the rest of my life. But as I allow the diminishment of the ego, then the work becomes more profound and more powerful. The work that I do, or that is being done through me, because I become more of a conduit for that work. And so as I recede, and I'm sure Rumi said a lot about this, but as I recede, as the ego diminishes, then more of spirit can shine through, and therefore all of our work becomes more powerful.
I think that's so beautifully said. I think you could say that what shadow work really gives you is an initiation into two related mysteries, into surrender, first of all.
Yes.
You come to learn through doing grueling shadow work just how much you have to surrender to the forces that shaped you. You have to really surrender to them to know who you are and how you are being transformed unconsciously by your shadow drives. And you have to surrender to the divine, because in the end, you come to see through your shadow work that you don't really exist, that you are a series of fantastical, rickety, precarious structures. Your identity is a series of games that you've invented for all kinds of bizarre reasons. And that is a phenomenal gift. And then it leads to the real immersion in the next truth, the next mystery, the mystery of truly, truly coming to know that you know nothing, and that you cannot know life, you cannot know the mystery, you cannot know God, you cannot know why the intelligence that is so transcendent is acting in the ways that it's acting. And once you're saved from your passion to know, which is one of the subtlest and most dangerous of shadows, then you come into a realm of spontaneity and child mind and wonder and awe and amazing subtle freedom. That is the beginning of a wholly new kind of life. And you can only go through the door of the shadow into that garden, because you can't go into that garden as anybody, as somebody with a vision of who they are, of how wonderful and righteous and brilliant and all the rest of it they are, because that's all ego. You can only go into the garden knowing you're nobody and you know nothing. And that's the great gift of the shadow, to just peel away all the pretensions until you're nobody and nothing, and then an explosion that can't be put into words happens inside you, so that you become your authentic self at last, which you cannot become without having had the shit beaten out of you by your shadow.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I do want to talk a little bit about our book because I think what we are offering, going to be offering, is really profound and very related to what you're talking about now. You know, doing shadow work leads to many things, but perhaps most importantly, joy. That's the paradox, is that doing shadow work really does lead to joy. And you and I are writing a book right now with a working title, Returning to Joy, Vibrant Living in a Flatline Culture. And one major focus of the book is the difference between happiness and joy. We live in a culture that's addicted to happiness, and yet very few people are in our culture are experiencing vibrant aliveness. On the other hand, many people throughout history have been vibrantly alive, and yet they've discovered a deep well of joy within themselves in spite of the suffering that they've had to endure. And in our book, we talk about the enemies of joy and how we can confront and transform them. You know, I'm feeling very passionate about our book because you and I sometimes get accused of being darkness junkies or shadow zealots. So writing a book on
Great, I
joy
love
is
shadow zealots, yes. SZ for short, yeah.
yeah, and writing a book on joy is a new twist for us with a familiar theme, which is that, well, happiness is the low hanging fruit of our culture that costs nothing.
Right.
Joy requires a commitment to doing inner
Oh,
emotional and spiritual work. So let's talk about this. And I'd like you to jump in, please, and I'll jump in after that.
well, if you've ever had even a fragment or a moment of mystical experience, you know the truth of what the Taittiriya Upanishad says. And this is the central truth of the universe, as all the mystics know. The Taittiriya says, from great bliss, all things were born. In great bliss, all things are sustained. And to great bliss, all things return. This is the highest mystical teaching. And what this great teaching makes clear to the world, to everyone, is that reality in its essence is an explosion of creative ecstasy. The Indian tradition says that the transcendent Father and the immanent Mother, the two aspects of the Godhead, are making love at every millisecond in all the universes, and that reality is overflowing with the orgasmic love juices of this monumental primordial lovemaking. This is a very grand and gorgeous way of putting into words what happens when you're graced a moment free of your petty self and blessed with entrance into the radiance of the full self, of the divine self. Because you know at that moment, by what is knowing you, that the essence of reality is joy. A joy in which all contradictions meet, all paradoxes are united, a joy of pure, blissful, ecstatic, conscious, illumined freedom. What you also understand is that that experience, while being complete and initiatory, cannot last until you've done monumental work in clearing away in yourself everything that resists that joy, everything that doesn't believe in that joy, everything that remains as a block to that joy, every single habit that perpetuates an enslavement that makes impossible the dancing of that joy in the different realms of your being. So this revelation that the essence of reality is joy, if you also have the revelation that in order to live that joy and be that joy, you're going to have to go through the most unbelievably rigorous discipline on every levels. If those two revelations can come together, then you're taking the authentic mystical path. You're then making the commitment to say, please make me an instrument of your joy and do to me whatever is necessary to clear away the me from me so I can blaze with you, so I can radiate with your beauty and your truth and your compassion and your cheerfulness and your energy and your joy. So what that really requires is a massive commitment to aligning yourself with that central knowledge of the nature of the universe, and a massive commitment to training yourself in heart, mind, soul, and body to turn to that nature of reality at every moment in what you are experiencing and what you are doing, to make yourself an alchemist of your own bliss, to be able at all moments to find ways to turn to what is radiant and ordered and joyful and possible in the depths of the moment, without denying the darkness or the suffering of the moment. That's what it means to stay aligned to ultimate truth at the most primordial level of yourself. And that is work. That is constant turning of the deepest attention to the one, to the total truth, to Allah, to the divine beloved. That is the constant work of the lover and the beloved. But the reward of that work is the reward of living in the divine presence, in the divine joy, in the divine compassion, in the divine illumination, normally, and living that life of gratitude and prayer and service, which is its own holy reward and its own joy, and a joy not dependent on any of the joys of the world, because it springs directly from the pure, living, crystalline heart of love itself.
And what I love about what you're saying, and one of the points that we're making in the book is that happiness costs nothing, and it's very shallow and illusory. But joy, which is permanent and deep and lasting, a price is required. And
Yes,
the
yes.
price is our lives.
Yes. The truth is that you will never know this joy until you die to yourself. That this great joy exists on the other side of a death, and that death is the crumbling away of your illusions about who you are, about the world, about the nature of reality, and the commitment to being radically humble enough to do the inner work, to stay aligned with the glory of truth beyond anything you can conceive. And that's very rare that people do that work at the level that it needs to be done, so that they can experience what comes to those who do the work, who allow the work to do them, so they can experience the level of radiance, energy, and joy, and tenderness, and compassion that flood the whole being once you're dead and still dancing.
I love what you just said, allowing the work to do them.
Yes. You can't do this work. It's not ours to do. The human agency is just not sufficient. Grace does the work. The whole work is to learn how to be supple and receptive to the grace of the spirit that does the work, and then not to interfere with it, with your vanity and folly and addiction and the rest of it.
Well, I have one more question to ask you, Andrew, and of course, this has to do with our predicament in the world. Every day, we're seeing worse degradation of our ecosystems, more violence and chaos in the world, more racism and ethnocentrism, as we're currently witnessing with many Europeans against refugees.
Yeah.
Every day, more is being revealed about the greed and bloodless avarice of the 1%, with Oxfam discovering that they're hiding trillions of dollars in offshore accounts that could be used to eliminate poverty and a vast array of human suffering. The entire paradigm on which a capitalist industrial civilization has been built is collapsing in front of our eyes on every level, as you mentioned a moment ago. We're looking at the potential extinction of most species on the planet in the next 50 or 100 years. So with all of this, what are the most important things that conscious human beings who truly see the horror of this global crisis should be doing?
Well, what I would invite them to do is, first of all, to truly make a commitment to a very simple but very daily spiritual practice, because, as my friend Marion Woodman said to me, you cannot possibly imagine getting through this crisis without a spiritual practice. It would be like going into a forest fire dressed in a paper tutu. So unless you really make a commitment to evolve your consciousness, you are going to be maddened and destroyed by what's unfolding. That's what I would love to say to everybody. The second thing that I would love to say to everybody is, however terrible the situation becomes, and it could become finally terrible, you still have one choice. And that is how you live your life, for what you live your life. And how you choose will determine much more than just the meaning of your life. It will determine the quality of your life. It will determine the energy that you feel. It will determine your relationship with eternal reality, whether or not you are thriving. And that's going to require of you that you learn how to die into love. And that's going to require that you truly realize that you will not be happy and cannot know true joy unless you make a commitment, a radical commitment to serve in this time other human beings and animals and the creation with your deepest gifts and your deepest resources. Whether your service will affect a revolution that changes everything isn't important. What is important is that you turn up in that service so you can know the great humble joy that comes to those who serve in whatever circumstances. And the last thing I'd like to say to everybody is that whatever happens, the beloved is here. The divine is here in us, all around us. The nature of reality is joy. We can learn how to live in this joy if we purify ourselves and commit ourselves to the work of clarifying the shadow and offering it up for conscious transformation. And we can learn to live in this joy if we truly abandon ourselves to love and to the works of love. So true success for me in this apocalyptic time is to live in unillusioned, illusionless joy, serving, giving everything for the sake of giving everything, not for the sake of any agenda. And so being rewarded by the freedom and the spontaneity and the creativity of the divine life itself.
Andrew, thank you so much for this time. It is such a joy to be with you and to have this conversation. I so deeply appreciate your work in the world and our friendship and all of the radical mischief that we're making and will make in the future.
You certainly, I think we're just getting started, actually.
I think we are, actually. Again, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.